Welcome, communication students, to our Mythology Unit Introduction. First, as you're listening to the screencast, make sure you are in fact listening. There's going to be more explanation than simply the words you see on the slides. This isn't about getting done as fast as possible. Second, let's also be clear what mythology is and what it isn't. So, as much as some people like Percy Jackson's books, Rick Riordan novels, and some don't, as much as some people like certain video games, some people like certain movies, mythology is so much more than that. So let's look at what myth is and what it isn't. See, myths have existed and continue to exist within every culture since the beginning of time. As long as there have been people, there have been myths. And we'll understand that more in the next couple slides. See, myths are stories that have a purpose. They're not random. They're not simply entertainment. They're not meant to be always exaggerations, but they are stories with a purpose. You may not always understand the story. You may not always see the purpose clearly, but they're there. Most people, unfortunately, think of myth as something that's untrue or something that's false. And that's only partly the case when it comes to myth. So we need to look at a different definition of mythology to help make more sense to you. See, myth is that which explains the unexplainable. Well, that's totally clear. Now we're done and can go on with the rest of our day. Or not quite. You see, when we have a hard time understanding something, we want to make sense of it. We can't always ignore it and let it go. We have to try to figure it out. And myth is people's attempt to try to do that. In fact, many examples of what we now call myth or mythology was once a culture's religion. These explanations can be trying to explain life and death, or right and wrong, why a certain flower is blue, and why storms happen. They might even try to explain what is really important, and perhaps what isn't so important. Good thing we already know when everything's important and nothing's important. See, well, history gives the facts about the who, what, when, where, sometimes why, and sometimes how. Myth reveals the personality, the fears, the hopes, the beliefs of a people. It's from the mythology we actually understand what people are like or what they were like in that culture. What was important to them, what they valued, not simply what happened. Perhaps if it's recent enough history, we have dates or names. Mythology gives us more than that. It helps us understand what people are like, as opposed to simply when they lived. All right. Now we're getting ready to take even more notes. We're going to get into 5 types of myths in this unit. Not equally, not evenly, and not all the time. But there are, in general, 5 types of myths that we're going to study. First, creation myths. Creation myths explain how the world, the universe, how everything came to exist. Origin myths. Now you look at creation and origin up in a dictionary and they'll tell you they're synonyms. But they're not quite the same thing. Creation is how things were created. Origin has to do with typically where people come from, how those people were created. Oftentimes, especially for many First Nations peoples, it talks about how they came to live in that place and why that place, why the rivers that run through their land, why the island they live on, why those things are important to them, because oftentimes their myths and their stories explain there's a purpose for them being there. It's not random. Natural myths explain how a plant, an animal, or land form, something in nature, how that came to exist. And it explains it in a specific way. Oftentimes we begin other types of myths with that. There are also historical myths that communicate the meaning of a historical event, even though the facts aren't often accurate. Most students, while they're in high school, at some point in time, study 2 epic poems from Greek literature. One is the Iliad, which is the story of the Trojan War and the fall of the city of Troy. The other is the Odyssey, which actually overlaps with the story of the city of Troy, but it's Odysseus, it's a journey he took to get home from the war. In both cases, people don't read those stories like they're actual fact. In fact, most people aren't even sure if Troy existed, and if it did, the Trojan War couldn't possibly have happened on the scale that the poem, the story, claims it did. But it does communicate some things that are corroborated, that are proven by other facts of the time. But the point of the story is not to simply give the facts. The point is to tell about the meaning, the why. Those are four of the most common types of myths people study. The one we're going to spend most of our time with is character myths. See, the character myths, they tell the story of specific characters and teach about virtues or vices that we are to possess or to avoid. So when we say character myths here, I don't mean character as in people, as in named individuals in a story. However, character is that kind of different definition of character. People talk about someone having good character. It means they have good qualities, which is where we get into the idea of what virtues and vices are. These are terms you might not have heard before, but they really do fit. See, a virtue is considered a positive personal characteristic or behavior that's admired. It helps society. It's a good thing. So if someone is virtuous, which is an adjective form, then they hold or have a particular virtue. A virtue is something people in that culture are supposed to do. So if that culture values honesty, then that is something that people are supposed to do. They're supposed to be honest. And their myths and their stories will tell about individuals who are honest and rewarded because of their honesty. The opposite of a virtue is a vice. A vice is a negative personal characteristic or behavior that is harmful to that one person, to one other individual, or to everyone in the society. In general, a vice is something people in that culture are supposed to avoid. Now, what makes this even more confusing is that, for example, sometimes a virtue in one culture might be a vice in a different culture. For example, it might be considered a virtue in some cultures to ask other people for ideas and input, even if you're the leader, before making a decision. In other cultures, that may be seen as weakness, and you're being a poor leader because you're not simply making that decision yourself. So virtues and vices can get really confusing. But it's also nowadays why a lot of people don't always agree on things and are surprised when someone does or says something they didn't think was okay. Well, it might be because in their culture, I don't necessarily mean capital C culture, I mean lowercase c culture, maybe the culture of their home. It might be the culture of their neighborhood. It doesn't necessarily mean the culture of the country they call home or the family came from. Those cultures, if they don't line up with the same values, the same virtues, the same vices, that's where we also can have conflict, which is why it's oftentimes pretty cool to look at myths from different characters and different cultures. It's also important to look at with character myths that sometimes, in some cultures, myths are used to explain why people do things without having a choice. You might see a phrase, particularly in ancient Greek or Latin mythology, Roman mythology, the gods made me do it. Notice the lowercase g on gods. We don't mean the capital G that refers to any one particular deity or god. It's not about a particular religion or belief system. Some of the gods made me do it. You might refer to it as fate. You might refer to it as chance or destiny. But all of these things, these myths, get the idea that it wasn't my choice in the first place. I can't control what I'm doing. I can't control what I'm saying. Somebody else, something else made me do it. And therefore, I'm not responsible. And so we lose the idea of what's called free will. Free will means you have the chance to choose what you do. You choose what you say. And sometimes people believe that we all have free will in everything we do. Other times, people don't think that's the case. It can be pretty confusing. But free will and your ability to choose comes up a lot in terms of mythology. Part of character myths is a subset or a subgroup called hero myths. These are actually pretty fun. So hero myths are a specific type of a character myth. The hero is oftentimes a virtuous character, or could be a virtuous in the end kind of character, somebody who's flawed, somebody who's imperfect, but they still represent what that culture is about in some way. And they embark on a journey or a quest to find or gain something. And we'll get into this a lot more detail as we get farther along, but every culture might explain ideas differently, even when there's a similar idea involved. Hero myths are kind of fun to look at because there's a predictable pattern. This is going to be a great example of you actually knowing a lot about this idea, but you don't necessarily know the terminology. Some of the terms that were dropped on you on the Google form that you filled out for Monday at the start of this unit. We're going to get into hero-ness and that pattern for the hero's quest later on. Big thought to leave you with as we get into this last unit. I hope you have fun with it, because truly myths are everywhere. And I hope you have fun finding them, not just in kind of books and literature and websites, and not just from Greece and Rome, but all around the world. Looking for similarities, looking for differences, looking for things that you believe in and things that people around you believe in that maybe you don't quite so much. This can be fun. Don't try to take it too seriously. Don't get too critical of somebody else and what they think, what they enjoy. This isn't just about fantasy. This isn't about whether or not you like doing mythology. It's not whether you like naming the planets. There's so much more here. And I hope you have a good time with it as we get ready to finish the year with this unit.